Welcome back to Face the Nation. For all the division on Capitol Hill, one subject that invites at least some bipartisan unity is the threat posed by China. For more, we return to our interview with the leaders of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark Warner and Marco Rubio. President Biden is reportedly close to issuing an executive order when it comes to restrictions on U.S. investments in China, but there's concern about risking further escalation. What's your view on how far that action should go?
The Chinese have found a way to use capitalism against us. And what I mean by that is the ability to attract investment into entities that are deeply linked to the state. That military commercial fusion that exists in China is a concept that we don't have in this country. We have contractors that do defense work, but there is no distinction in China between advancements in technology, biomedicine, whatever it might be, and the interests of the state. And then the second is obviously the access to our capital markets. And the third is the risk pose. We don't, up to this point, have not had levels of transparency in terms of auditing and the like on these investments into these companies. When you invest in these companies in U.S. exchanges, you don't have nearly as much information about the bookkeeping of those companies as you would an American company or a European company, because they've refused to comply with those restrictions. So there's systemic risk to our investments. And then there's also the geopolitical reality that American capital flows are helping to fund activities that are ultimately designed to undermine our national security.
Beginning of the 20th century, I was a big believer that the more you bring China into the world order, the more things will all be copacetic. We were just wrong on that. The Communist Party, under President Xi's leadership, and my beef is, be clear, with the Communist Party. It's not with the Chinese people or the Chinese diaspora, wherever it is in the world, but they basically changed the rules of the road. They made clear in Chinese law that every company in China's ultimate responsibility is to the Communist Party, not to their customers, not to their shareholders. We have actually, in a bipartisan way, didn't get a lot of attention, over the last 7 years, have been out and we've done 20 classified briefings for industry sector after industry sector about these risks. Frankly, pre-COVID, we kind of got nods, but some pushback because a lot of companies
just wanted access to the market.
We're making a lot of money off Chinese tech companies. Now, post-COVID, I think there is an awakening that this is a real challenge. And I think the good news is that not only is there awakening in America, but a lot of our allies around the world are seeing this threat as well.
So you want restrictions on biotech, battery technology, semiconductors, artificial intelligence?
I want to have an approach that says we need to look at foreign technology investments, foreign technology development, regardless of country, if it poses a national security threat, and have some place that can evaluate this. We need a frame to systemically look at this. And frankly, it goes just beyond the so-called CFIUS legislation about inbound or outbound investment.
That's a committee that looks at national security risks.
But understanding that, 20 years ago, everybody thought capitalism was going to change China, and we woke up to realization that capitalism didn't change China, China changed capitalism. And they've used it to their advantage and to our disadvantage, and not simply from an old Soviet perspective to take us on from a geopolitical or military perspective. They've done so from a technological and industrial perspective. And so you have seen the largest theft and transfer of intellectual property in the history of humanity occur over the last 15 years, some of it funded by American taxpayers.
They have the biggest hacking ability program than any other nation. Intelligence community says they're the world leader in surveillance, in censorship. How restricted should their ability to access this market be?
I think it is nearly impossible for any Chinese company to comply with both Chinese law and our expectations in this country. Chinese law is very clear. If you're a Chinese company and we ask you for your data, we ask you for your information, we ask you for what you have, or we ask you to do something, you either do it or you won't be around. You
want to ban Chinese companies from investing in America?
Well, I think there's certain investments where there's no way we could protect the country from doing it. Again, we go back to TikTok. People say, why do we care about what some 16-year-olds are doing? I don't think the threat is that some 16-year-old likes these cool videos that are on there, which I admit are attractive, obviously because the artificial intelligence makes it so. It's the massive amount of data that they're collecting, not on one 16-year-old, not on 1,000 16-year-olds, but on millions and millions of Americans that give them commercial advantages, potentially the advantage of being able to shape American public opinion in a time of crisis, that just give them extraordinary insights that allow them to steer the conversation in this country in any direction they want.
But this has been talked about for 3 years now. The Trump administration tried to ban it. The Biden administration still hasn't pulled the trigger.
Maybe we were all a little bit slow to recognize the challenge here. It is both a data collection entity. Now, it may not collect as much data as some of our American platforms, but it is very much, at the end of the day, still responsible to the Communist Party. But think about this, Margaret. 138 million users in America use TikTok on a regular basis, average about 90 minutes a day. The fact is, the algorithms that determine what you see on TikTok is determined out of Beijing by China. And the proof is, if you look at what Chinese kids are seeing on their version of TikTok, which emphasizes science and engineering, versus what our kids and kids around the world are seeing, it is dramatically different. So both from a data collection and from, frankly, a propaganda tool, it is of huge concern.
CBS spoke to TikTok about their plans, and the company said they had come to an agreement over the summer in terms of how they could structure things to separate and create a wall to protect against some of these concerns. They said they can continue operating in the U.S. by offering data protections. Do you both know what they are offering? And you're laughing, so I'm guessing this isn't sufficient.
I don't know what the data protections are, and there's a technical aspect to it, but it's beyond the data protections. I filed a bill to ban it last year. We're going to refile it again this year. It's bipartisan, it's bicameral. Some people are not willing to go that far, but I certainly think it's the right place to be. But in the end, we got to do something about it, whether it's a ban or something else. I honestly don't know. As I sit here with you today, I don't know how our national security interests and the operation of TikTok in this country, as long as it's owned by ByteDance, can coexist.
And you want to force a sale?
I've been wanting to do that for 3 years.
I may have a slightly different approach. I'm going to sit down and see how we can work through this. But I've been hearing, and I've been trying to give the Biden administration now more than 2 years to see, is there a technical solution here? And I'd be willing to take a look at it. Biden administration has not announced that. And I think the problem is, this is technically extraordinarily hard to do. TikTok has repeatedly said, oh, Americans' data not being seen in China. And repeatedly, we've seen Chinese engineers having access to American data.
But it's already been downloaded 200 million times. How do you convince a 16-year-old to delete the app and get rid of the phone? I mean, isn't this very hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube?
Absolutely. But this is one of the reasons why I think Congress has been horribly unsuccessful at this. I've been saying for years, and we may not fully agree on this, but that on all these social media companies, a lot of good, but there is a dark underbelly. And the fact that the United States, historically, we would have set some rules of the road for these entities in terms of standards, in terms of protocols, in terms of appropriate behavior, in terms of questions like even like basic privacy.
Right.
But our failure to do so has mean we have ceded that leadership, often now times to the Europeans or to individual states. And I think that's frankly a loss of American leadership. You know, for most of my lifetime, we led virtually in every innovation area. We suddenly woke up with 5G, a wireless communication, where China was setting the standards. We woke up in an industry like semiconductor chips and woke up. We used to own this and we've lost it. We've seen now the solar industry where it's all migrated to China. Think about this notion around quantum computing, the ability to break any kind of encryption, or artificial intelligence. Those technologies are driven by an authoritarian regime out of China. I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum in America. That's not good news or for free people anywhere in the world.
Aren't you going to run headlong into business interests here in the United States? I mean, just look at Elon Musk. The U.S. government relies on his company, SpaceX. He has a majority in car company Tesla. He has control over the internet connection in Ukraine via Starlink. And he now owns Twitter. You said there's no one in the world more dependent on the Communist Party than Elon Musk.
My concern is, if you look at Mr. Musk's public statements, they're almost all supportive of the oversight regime in China, and they're almost all derogatory about the oversight regime in America and in Europe. And part of that, I think, whether it's knowingly or not, is where does he get all his batteries that go into all these Teslas? They are, built in China, mostly, frankly, with a lot of Uyghur labor, and Senator Rubio has been the leader on trying to make sure that the Chinese Communist Party's treatment of the Uyghur people is prohibited. And I've yet to hear from Mr. Musk how that kind of contradiction about comments about the CCP in China and what he's dealing with Uyghur labor, how that's not going to influence some of his decisions.
It goes beyond Elon Musk. I mean, business interests have invested both in access to the Chinese market, but also in the means of production. And it's allowed them, in many cases, historically, to be deputized. That includes the finance and investment world, to come to Washington and argue for things that are against the national interest, but in favor of their short and midterm profit line for their investors, for their company.
Senator Rubio, as a conservative, you have to feel a little bit uncomfortable with talking about government intervention in private industry. But that has been the U.S. solution in some ways to the semiconductor issues you were raising, this subsidy to try to bring chip making back to America.
Well, I would argue this. I don't believe in government intervention in the private sector, but I do believe in government intervention in our national security.
These are subsidies.
Capitalism is going to give you the most efficient outcome. But sometimes, what do you do when the most efficient outcome is not in our national interest? Because it's more efficient to buy rare earth minerals from the Chinese. It's more efficient to have things built over there in many cases. But is it in our national interest to depend on them for 80-something% of the active ingredients in our pharmaceuticals? I could argue it was not. And in those instances where the market efficient outcome is not in our national interest, it is my opinion that we default to the national interest, because without our national interest and our national security, the other things won't matter. We are not a market, we're a nation. And the market exists to serve the nation, not the nation to serve the market.
The $50 billion that taxpayers just pumped in to the CHIPS bill and semiconductors, that's just the start. That you think other legislation's coming like that?
One of the reasons that it took us $52 billion, and that was for both semiconductors and next generation wireless, was because candidly, I think we went asleep at the switch for a long time. And we had to suddenly play catch up because we'd seen China advance, and we'd also seen Taiwan, our friend, and one of the reasons why we need to be supportive, where frankly, every advanced chip in all of our jet satellites and seacraft are made in Taiwan. We were chasing after the fact. If we can get ahead on some of these key areas, I don't think we will need that kind of investment, but we are going to need to make sure that we've got a plan in place to make sure that these new technology domains don't all end up in China.
We need to identify what are the critical industries and capacities that our country needs to be able to have without being leveraged or having to go to the Chinese to get it. And then we need to figure out what government's role is. Now, I want to make sure that we're not turning this into a lobbyist trough where every industry comes here and gets money. And we have to make sure that we're going to invest in research, that research is protected, that there's sufficient safeguards. Because what's the point of putting billions of dollars to innovate something they're going to steal anyway? But I do think, again, this is not about government running or owning these companies. We're not going to rely on the Chinese or someone else to make it for us, because we'll be denied that capability in a time of conflict.
Can you get that through a divided Congress?
I actually think if there's one issue that still is extraordinarily bipartisan, it is a growing concern about China and a recognition that in this technology race, second place is not good enough for us.
We actually haven't had a bipartisan interview like this in about 3 years. So to see a Democrat and Republican sit down and talk about issues of substance is great to see.
Thank you.
Thank you both. We'll be right back. One day after the video of Tyre Nichols' deadly encounter with police was made public, the Memphis police shut down its Scorpion unit, a specialized group which includes the 5 officers that have now been charged with second-degree murder. For more, we now go to former Democratic Congresswoman Val Demings, who spent 27 years with the Orlando Police Department, including 4 years as its chief. It's good to talk to you.
Margaret, thank you. It's good to be with you.
What was your reaction when you saw the video of these 5 officers beating Tyre Nichols?
You know, as someone who spent 27 years in law enforcement, started out as an officer on midnight shift patrol and served in every rank, served as the chief of police. I've seen policing at its best and I've seen it at its worst. But what I saw in the video was shocking and appalling. The gruesome beating. My heart goes out to the Wells Nichols family. It goes out to his community. And I so appreciate the words from Miss Wells when she not only talked about the gruesome death of her son, but also spoke to the 5 officers involved by saying that you've disgraced yourselves and your own family. So as a career law enforcement officer, I could not believe what I was seeing.
It stood out to me that those 5 officers in Memphis were between the ages of 24 and 32 years old. They were all hired within the last 6 years. Is this an experience problem? Is this a bad cop problem?
You know, Margaret, it is so important that we look at, as police executives and there's not much of an appetite, we know, in Washington, D.C. now to come up with the national standards that I believe are so desperately needed. I also question what state legislatures are willing to do. But this falls back now on police executives, our chiefs, our sheriffs, to come up with much needed reforms that start with hiring the brightest and the best, having psychological evaluations being a part of that to ensure fitness for duty. And look, I'm more than familiar with specialized units. Many of them are the results of calls from the community for officers to address crime activities and like drug activity, gang activity. But we have to make sure as police executives that we are putting the most seasoned and most experienced officers in this unit that are well trained and highly supervised. So as I look at the night that went off the rails in Memphis, there are a lot of questions that are unanswered, but have to be answered.
But we are hearing from mayors across this country that they are facing, in many places, shortages of police officers, people willing to do the work. The mayor of New Orleans was here last week telling us that. She's now asked for federal marshals and ATF agents in her city. Why is this such a problem?
Well, hiring as someone who has actually hired law enforcement officer, it has always been challenging, not necessarily because of the lack of numbers, but the effort to make sure that we are hiring people who have the right temperament to be able to do the job. I can remember in a year having 40,000 people who wanted to be Orlando police officers, and we ended up hiring maybe 20 of that 40,000, trying to take every effort, every step to make sure that we hire the best person to do the job. And so hiring has always been challenging. But we also, again, police executives have to be creative, not just wait for people to knock on that door, but to go out into various communities, visiting college campuses, making sure that police departments do continue to reflect the diversity of the communities that they serve. This is a time that we have to use new and creative approaches to making sure that we're bringing in the right men and women. It really starts with hiring, making sure that we are bringing in the right men and women to do the job.
How would you judge the performance of the Memphis police chief, who has said this unit, the Scorpion unit, did good work?
I know C.J. Davis. She is a professional law enforcement officer. She worked as a deputy chief in Atlanta, the chief of Durham. She is now, of course, the chief in Memphis. And I think that she has handled this very tragic incident as well as she could. We all have commented on the swift action with the firing them, working very closely with the DA to bring those charges forward in a very expeditious manner. She's also been very transparent with the community, and boy, do we need to see more of that. She was also the president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. She is very well trained, and I do believe, while this is one of the toughest moments in our country, that she is the right leader to lead us through this very tough time.
Well, I wonder, because I was reading a piece in New York Magazine entitled "The End of Police Reform," and it pointed out that in Memphis, adaptations had been made since 2020 in terms of mandating de-escalation, banning chokeholds. There were body cameras. That wasn't a deterrent here. The police force is 60% black, it reported, with a black police chief. Even with these adjustments, this horrific situation happened. So when you hear calls for police reform, what is the piece of reform you think that makes the difference? Or is it just recruitment?
Margaret, we have made calls for police reform, especially since the brutal death of George Floyd. Now, let me say this. I was in Congress during the time voted for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which, we all know it was not perfect. But my goodness, I sure believe it was a major step in the right direction. And I think that too many police executives think that any criticism of the police or any efforts to reform or modify hiring standards, modify training standards, make sure they have the technology that they need to better be able to do the job, calling for national databases and better enforcement. Too many people see that as we're not supporting the police. Well, I see it as exactly that. Supporting the police, giving them the tools that they need to do the job, but also to hold them accountable. And so, yeah, it's not just hiring, but it doggone sure starts with hiring. When they're in training, making sure that we have the right field training officers who we know set the standard for what's acceptable and unacceptable on the street. Looking at internally at policies and modifying those use of force policies. Yes, the body cameras. Think about if we did not have this footage. But this situation was so off the rails and so outside of the box. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there.
I hear your passion there. Thank you for sharing your analysis with us. We'll be back in a moment. A recent outbreak of violence has raised security concerns in the Mideast. CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tayyib is in Jerusalem.
Secretary Blinken's visit comes as violence continues to sweep across Israel and the occupied West Bank, and violence so deadly we haven't seen it on this scale in several years. Now, yesterday saw the funeral of a married couple who were shot dead alongside 5 others by a suspected Palestinian gunman just outside a synagogue on Friday. The alleged 21-year-old attacker's family home has now been sealed shut by Israeli police as part of a series of punitive measures passed by recently re-elected Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet, who are described as the most extreme right-wing government this country has ever seen. The new measures, which follow a massive Israeli raid on the Palestinian city of Jenin, in which 9 Palestinians were killed, also includes taking away the IDs, work permits, and other rights of families of suspected attackers. Now, separately, Blinken's visit to the region comes as Iran says bomb-carrying drones targeted several defense facilities, including one in Iran's central city of Isfahan overnight. And while there is no immediate claim of responsibility, Tehran has been targeted in suspected strikes by its bitter rival Israel for years now. Margaret.
We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. I'm Margaret Brennan.